Hello and welcome to the Church of Truth, where we will try to help you differentiate opinion from fact and faith from belief. Throughout history, human beings, like most primates, have been naturally hierarchical. They seek an ordered social structure, with those deemed worthy on top and the less powerful on the bottom. Usually people tend to imagine themselves worthy of the top rungs of the ladder. And when they don't feel they have received the status they want to believe they deserve, they start looking for a reason. They want to blame someone or some group for holding them back. This is human nature. Sometimes the feelings are justified. When we live in a society that oppresses others based on their perceived race or ethnicity or religion, often entire societies will seek out someone to blame for their own failings. Usually they will focus on a minority group, a group that can be differentiated from us and made into a they. This other can then be dehumanized. They are not like us. They don't think the same way we do, and they don't care about others the way we do. They don't feel pain the same way we do. This dehumanization then becomes an excuse for destruction. They don't deserve to live like we do. Throughout history, this pattern has repeated over and over again. Human beings will often strive to hold themselves and their communities above others, to try to convince themselves that they were lucky enough or worthy enough to be born into the best family, best clan, best tribe, or best nation that has ever existed. Once convinced that this is true, that they have greater rights than others, the opposite side of the coin inevitably turns up. They are unworthy of life. At this point, some type of religion steps in usually. A teaching or philosophy that justifies purging society of the other, for the supposed good of all. The following massacres, slaughters, and genocides is then seen as justified. A holy war. These people don't worship our God. They worship their own. Then comes the vilification. They harm children. They sacrifice children to their God. Nothing will make emotion blind a human more than an appeal to protect the children. But what about the children of the persecuted during these pogroms? The story of what happened when Moses and his tribe were chased out of Egypt and came upon fertile land owned by another tribe is the best example. What did Moses tell his people? That a God had commanded that he lead his people into this land and not leave anything that breathes. He admonished his warriors to kill their men, women, and children, even their babies. So a supposedly all-knowing, all-powerful, all-merciful God can find no better way to save the children than to slaughter them all? This is a very familiar historical pattern. The most common excuse for the most horrible of deeds is usually a religious one. People will excuse almost anything if presented to them in a religious context. Why does this story repeat itself throughout recorded history, and even in prehistory? Evidence of Stone Age massacres have been found, and sometimes there are human teeth marks on human bones. How can we treat other human beings like this? And how do we choose who to target? Who do we most often claim to be life unworthy of life? It is always those who have something we covet, or those who are different than we are. Those we can push into a category of other. But why do we form these categories of us and them? The human mind likes to categorize things. It is an innate skill and an impulse to do so. This helps us organize and understand the world, but it also makes us prone to classification errors. For example, this man is easy to distinguish as evil when juxtaposed with this one. But in actuality, this man had joined the Nazi Party to try to save his friend who was Jewish. And this man marched with the Nazis and told them they were doing God's work as they slaughtered the innocent. We get uncomfortable when something does not fit neatly into a specific category. And we often try to make it fit anyway, or pretend it doesn't exist or doesn't matter. And that brings us to today's topic. I see a rising animosity against human beings of different sexual gender or identity than the average. I know where this animosity will lead if we do not defend our fellow human beings from it. It has all the trappings of a religious purge, a holy war, a cleansing, a genocide. You will notice lately that there are people calling themselves religious who insist that their religion allows and even requires them to attack members of our society who are either not in the majority or who have been stripped of effective power based on gender or sexual identity. We will explain to you today why this is a violation of fundamental human rights, and no different than the persecution suffered throughout history upon Africans, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and transsexuals for being different than those in power. Humans have developed two main concepts to classify ourselves by sex. Those are gender and sexual orientation. Let's start with a brief primer on gender and begin with the science of genetics. DNA is the molecule that contains the code for our genetic identity. This code tells cells how to develop and function. Human beings usually have 23 chromosomes. Having an additional chromosome, like trisomy 21, also called Down syndrome, is usually detrimental to someone's health. There are also trisomies 8, 13, 18, and 22. Putting these exceptions to the side for now, most humans have two sets of 23 genes in every cell in their body, with the exception of sperm and egg producing cells, called gametes, which will have only one set, randomly mixed from the inherited full two sets. In most humans, 22 of these 23 chromosomes are the same in both male and female, and are called autosomes numbers 1 to 22. The last one is called the sex chromosome, and is usually either X or Y. It is the X and Y chromosomes that start to influence sexual identity. All human embryos start as female. That is a scientific fact. Every human on this planet started their existence as female, developing mammary papillae, blood vessels, and nerves just like females. This includes the genitals. All fetal genitalia start the same, and they are all phenotypically female. It is only after the male fetus starts to produce testosterone that male sexual physiology starts to diverge from female. If a fetus has two X chromosomes, they usually continue to go on as fully female, not making the testosterone needed to become male. If the fetus has a Y chromosome, it will usually start to produce testosterone beginning in week 7 of gestation, reaching a maximum during weeks 9 to 11, then decreasing until weeks 15 to 20, finally stopping almost completely until age 12 or so, when it revs back up, taking us through puberty and maintaining production through middle age, then fading slowly and dropping rapidly after age 80. Women produce estrogen, which helps to build and maintain stereotypically female genitals and characteristics. Men do also, but the estrogen is overpowered by the testosterone. This seems simple, and it is convenient for some to insist that there are therefore only two genders and two sexual identities, male and female. Two X chromosomes and you're a woman. One X and one Y and you're a man. But this would not be accurate. Human beings, and indeed all animals, are more complex than this. In the first place, birds are the opposite of humans. XX is male and XY is female. And there are many variations throughout the plant and animal kingdoms, but we will focus our discussion today on humans. The process described above for human beings is actually not as simple as it sounds. In reality, it is quite complicated and variable. First, the gene that codes for the production of testosterone can be defective, in which case no testosterone is made, and the fetus goes on to develop stereotypically female characteristics, despite being XY. Or the Y chromosome can be lacking the SRY gene, which codes for the androgen receptor, thereby making this person's cells unable to respond to androgens like testosterone. This person will also go on to follow a stereotypically female physiology, but will usually be unable to have children. The actress Jamie Lee Curtis bravely discussed discovering this about herself. This woman is genetically male. She has a Y chromosome. Should she now be banned from women's athletic competitions and bathrooms? But since her body was unable to respond to testosterone, how would that be fair? And there are other variations. There are X chromosomes that gain the SRY gene. This is called XX male syndrome. These people are genetically female, with two X chromosomes, but can develop completely or partially as male, due in 90% of cases to this gene being on an X chromosome. The other 10% have other causes. These people develop along a spectrum of increasing masculinization to the point that they can be indistinguishable from an XY male. Should we then force them to go to the women's bathroom and allow them to compete against genetically XX women in sports? You may say that these are rare exceptions, and they can be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But the exceptions become so common that they cannot be ignored, and the situation is more complicated than just these exceptional individuals. What about XX chromosome women who have a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome? These women will sometimes produce high levels of testosterone and may develop stereotypically male pattern bone and muscle structure, or just have more muscle mass than the average woman. Should the other women be allowed to take testosterone to level the playing field? And what about other genetic combinations? There are people with only 45 chromosomes, like X0, where a woman has one X chromosome. This is called Turner syndrome. Y0 does not survive fetal development usually, unless the fetus is a mosaic, where some of the cells are 45Y and the rest are 46XY or some other variable combination. Mosaics are people with two different genetic cell types, and much more common than you might think. Then there are people with more than just two sex chromosomes. This is called sex chromosome aneuploidy. Up to 20% of pregnancies are estimated to have one of these variations. These include XXX, XXY, and XYY. XXY is called Klinefelter syndrome and occurs in 1 out of every 500 women born, meaning there are about 32 million women with this condition in the United States right now. XXX is called trisomy X and affects 1 out of every 1,000 females, so there are about 16 million of this variation living in the United States. They can be completely free of any symptom, or can develop complications from this genetic variation. XYY affects about 1 in every 1,000 males, and is only diagnosed in an estimated 10% of cases. This is sometimes called Jacobs syndrome. They are a little more likely to be taller than average, have a little difficulty with expressive language development, and are more prone to autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit than the average male, though most of these men have no symptoms at all. At one time, a researcher claimed that this genetic variation was more likely to be incarcerated, but further studies did not support this hypothesis. A little more than 750,000 people in the U.S. have one of these sex chromosome trisomy variations. Then there are 48 chromosome variations: 48XXYY, 48XXXY, and 48XXXX. These are called the tetrasomies. XXYY are phenotypically male, while XXXY are similar to Klinefelter's XXY syndrome. 1 out of every 440 births will have some type of sex chromosome aneuploidy variation. That means there are about 730,000 of these variations in the general U.S. population, bringing the total number of human beings in the U.S. with more than 2 sex chromosomes to almost 1.5 million people. And that brings us to a realization. Gender is not as simple as XX and XY, male and female. Some people have 3 or even 4 sex chromosomes, and being XX does not necessarily make you female, while being XY does not necessarily make you male. There are often hundreds of variations of functional genes, making some XY males more or less responsive to hormones that can influence sexual physiology, and the same for XX women. Knowing this, we must now accept that chromosomal identity, XX or XY, does not determine sexual physiology completely. What we usually classify as gender, and we must understand that there is a spectrum of the physiological manifestations of genetic sexual identity, that it gets more complicated. It turns out that while our sexual physiology, our physical characteristics, are influenced by genetics, they are also influenced by something called epigenetics. Epigenetics are effects on gene expression, the increasing or decreasing of a gene's activity. It turns out that if your grandparents suffered starvation, like in Ukraine and Scandinavia under Soviet and Nazi occupation respectively, the genes for a leaner physiology are quieted, and those for storing more fat are amplified. This is done by methylation, demethylation, and other ways, and can be carried down into the gametes, the reproductive cells, causing the children and even grandchildren of those who suffered to be more prone to obesity. This is true of other conditions also. There is a genetic and epigenetic component to anxiety disorder. Being born happy and relaxed in a war zone may not be an effective protection. Even conditions like psychopathy, the lack of normal emotions and empathy, can aid survival when everyone around you is being massacred. There are many factors that can influence gene expression, influencing not just how we act as adults, but how we develop as children. And this brings us to psychological sexual orientation. This has more to do with sexual attraction than to what we perceive as gender. We can start with some summarizations. Most men are attracted to women, heterosexual, about 97%. But some men are only attracted to other men, homosexual, about 1.6%. And other men, about 0.9%, are bisexual, being attracted to both men and women, with the remaining 0.5% describing themselves usually as asexual, not having any sexual interest in either sex. But of the 97% of men who describe themselves as heterosexual, 37% reported having at least one homosexual experience, and 46% reported having some sexual attraction to both men and women, even if they didn't act on it. For members of the general population who identify as women, the numbers are 97.7% heterosexual, 0.8% homosexual, and 1.4% bisexual. But of this 97.7% heterosexual, more than half of these women, about 60%, report being attracted to other women. 45% had kissed other women, and 50% had persistent fantasies about other women. Interestingly, half of the men and 2/3 of the women who had same-sex experiences still regarded themselves as heterosexual, perhaps for cultural, including religious reasons. These people choose to deny to others, and most likely themselves, that human beings are too complicated to put into simple categories. They are afraid of being singled out, of being made into the other, of not being considered normal. And they have a good reason to be. A fundamentalist Christian openly argued on an American news channel that pagan protesters to a nativity scene should be shot on sight. There were no recriminations or consequences for this. It is still a fact that we live in an intolerant world. Attacks and murders of non-average genders and orientations are still not investigated or prosecuted with the same vigor by police. The most often attacked and vulnerable seem to be transgender people. The feeling that your mind was not the same as your birth gender was, and still is in much of the world, considered a mental illness, a delusion. And homosexuality is sometimes argued to be a choice. That never made sense to me growing up in rural America. Why would any human being choose a behavior that put them in danger of ridicule and attack? Within my lifetime, it was a crime to be homosexual in the U.S. military. They were hunted down and thrown out or thrown in prison. Why would anyone choose to suffer this way? And then there's the question of transsexuals and gender dysphoria. How could someone have a male body and a female mind, or vice versa? It turns out that there are identifiable average differences between male and female brains. These can be found by high-resolution MRI. These differences correlate across the spectrum of transgender and homosexual people. But the variety of variation is so fluid that no one structural difference can be easily identified. And while this is true across almost all functional areas of the brain, what could cause some of these incredible varieties of differences? It turns out that the mammalian brain appears to be fundamentally female. As we said earlier, all humans start out female. And testicular hormones, or androgens, cause sexual differentiation in the brain, causing it to change into a more male pattern. There is one area in particular that tends to be an indicator of sex hormone activity in the developing brain. This area is called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. Right here, in this area, testosterone, released by the developing fetus, will activate neurons to actually produce more estradiol, what is normally considered a female hormone, than would be produced in a stereotypically female brain. It is interesting that intraneuronal higher levels of estradiol help create a male pattern brain. The developing brain does not put neurons where it needs them. It puts them everywhere and gets rid of the ones it doesn't need. Hormonal influences determine neuronal survival in some areas, carving out a male or female pattern in this area. The sexually dimorphic nucleus is larger in male pattern brains than it is in the female. It is also more spherical in males and elongated in females. This appears to be true in all mammals studied so far and many non-mammalian species. Interestingly, cell death shrinks this area to only about 10% of its useful size by age 70. This is not the only area of the brain influenced by sex hormones, but it is the most dependably indicative of hormonal influence in utero. How does the size of this area correlate with sexual orientation? Let's look at male sheep for a moment, called rams, since they have been studied extensively. It turns out that about 8% of rams are homosexual, and a small percentage of homosexuality seems to be the normal level found in most mammalian and avian species studied so far, including humans. These homosexual rams turn out to have their equivalent of the sexual dimorphic nucleus to be only half the size of heterosexual rams. Not only that, but when this area is surgically reduced in some animals, ferrets for example, their behavior actually changes from male pattern to female pattern attraction. Knowing this, let's look at how a physiologically male human being might end up with a female brain pattern. It turns out that when a woman has a male fetus and the fetus starts producing testosterone, there will be some crossover of testosterone to the mother, and she may develop antibodies against the testosterone. These antibodies would then reduce the amount of testosterone available to influence the fetus. This could cause the fetal brain to maintain a more female pattern in the sexual dimorphic nucleus. When the child is born, the mother's antibodies would no longer be present. Testosterone would take over, and the child would develop a more standard male pattern physiology. But the brain would maintain its female pattern structure. This child may grow up to feel that they are a female mind in a male body. This would not be a delusion. It would be a fact. There is another situation where a woman pregnant with a female fetus could develop high testosterone levels. This is common in women with a condition called polycystic ovarian syndrome and sometimes in a condition called preeclampsia. This would expose the female fetus to high testosterone levels in utero, causing a male pattern brain differentiation to occur. When the baby is delivered, the testosterone would stop, and the child's body would develop as stereotypically female. This could create a condition where a male brain would find itself in a female body. Again, this is no delusion. This is just one of the millions of variations of human development possible. There are thousands of different processes that could have similar effects. Some would argue that these are all rare exceptions and should be ignored, and that most people fit neatly into one of the two categories that make the classifier most comfortable. But I would argue, from my decades of studying science, medicine, and the human mind, that no individual human being is ever normal if we define that as being average. Normal applies only to a group and has no true meaning when applied to an individual. I would argue that these so-called exceptions are so prevalent as to represent normal variation within the human species. I would argue that every individual is an exception. Show me any human being, and I will be able to find something unique about them, something that makes them different from everyone else. Even genetically identical twins diverge through epigenetics and environmental influences so that by adulthood, they are easily distinguishable, both physically and psychologically. I implore each and every one of you to speak out against those who would target any variation in our family of humanity based on these arbitrary categories that people do not choose and that have nothing to do with our worth as human beings, and stand united for separation of church and state, so that appeals to the teachings of one religion or another will never again be used as an excuse to murder. And when it comes to Christians, there is a unique hypocrisy to their hatred. Some of them will quote the Old Testament, which said that homosexuality was an abomination. But I would argue that Jesus did not believe the Old Testament should be followed. Jesus said, "Some will say unto you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that if an evil man should smite thee, turn the other cheek." Jesus did not follow the Old Testament because parts of it were evil. To follow the Old Testament would be to create a society indistinguishable from that created by the Islamic State in Syria, ISIS. That is where blindly following the ignorant rhetoric of unknown authors writing thousands of years ago will lead you. To the slavery of women based on their gender. To the murder of human beings for being a variation other than the average. To the killing of peaceful, loving people for simply being as nature made them. And if you think that you are safe because you don't fit into one of these categories, remember that no human being is average or normal in every respect, and that someone, somewhere, either reading an ancient book or writing a new one, can find an excuse to make you the other and throw you on the pyre. Jesus said, "In the kingdom of heaven there is neither male nor female." Therefore, no true Christian can discriminate against anyone based on perceptions of gender and sexual orientation. We are all the children of the same universe. When we kill others, we kill ourselves. Let us live our lives under the principle that every life has value and no one is beyond redemption. Primum nihil nocias, deinde meo defesis.